Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to see such a great audience. I want to thank the Stimson Center for co-organizing and hosting the event this morning, and also to our three speakers, who I'll introduce shortly. And thanks to all of you that have taken the time from your busy schedules to be here with us this morning to discuss distributed ledger technology and trade security. Before we get started on the panel's remarks and discussion, I'm going to say a few words about the context for this event and also the objectives and what I hope that everybody will get out of it. The morning's event marks the official launch of the Strategic Trade Association, the first global association for export control and sanctions practitioners and researchers. The association is a new initiative from the Strategic Trade Research Institute, which is a nonprofit, board-governed institute that is the home to the Strategic Trade Review, a peer-reviewed journal dedicated to sanctions and export controls. The aim of the association is to build networks of research and practice. Strategic trade is a complex field that involves many different stakeholder groups, government agencies, industry, customs, enforcement, consultants, lawyers, and many more. And it's important for all of these stakeholder groups to be in connection with each other. The aim of the association is to link and connect these groups. Doing so helps to organize and share knowledge, stay on top of the latest trends and developments, advance the state of the art on certain important topics, and also bring about coordinated and targeted action where appropriate. By joining the association, you can be part of this global community of export controls and sanctions stakeholders. The association will host bi-monthly events such as this one, centered around topics of interest that are current, forward-thinking, and actionable. It'll also give access to members to the Strategic Trade Review, the peer-reviewed journal that I mentioned earlier, provide networking opportunities through a directory, job board, and news page, and kickstart a mentorship program which is meant to provide pathways to students and young professionals that are interested in entering a field in strategic trade. Before I get to introducing today's topic and speakers, I'd encourage everyone in this room to visit the website of the association, strategictradeassociation.org, and become a member. And you can also talk to me after this event about how to join. Now to blockchain. Today's event is the first association event, and I've chosen the topic of distributed ledger technology and trade security because it's representative of the kind of topics that the association will explore, areas where we can all participate in the conversation, take information and ideas that can benefit us in whatever our roles are, and potentially impact the future course of events. Distributed ledger technology is the technology that underpins digital currencies such as Bitcoin, but it has far wider applications, such as in healthcare, for refugees, for shipping, and many others. But the point of the discussion this morning isn't to give you a 101 course on this technology. Actually, the objectives of the event are threefold. The first is to ask how distributed ledger technology impacts and will change, if at all, important areas of trade security, such as export controls, trade finance, supply chain management, and nonproliferation. Second, given all the hype surrounding distributed ledger technology, the speakers will attempt to separate reality from hype in the trade and security context. Third and finally, we'll aim to engage every one of you in the discussion in the Q&A and hopefully leave you with important takeaways to continue the discussion following the end of today's meeting. So we can begin the panel now. First to speak will be Jonathan Tame, who is a manager at Deloitte, followed by Aaron Arnold, who is a research fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard, and finally Cindy Vestergaard, who heads the Safeguards program here at Stimson and also is leading an exploratory project on distributed ledger technology that you can find on the Stimson Center website. So with that, Jonathan, please, your remarks. Thank you.
And thank you, sure, yep. Thank you to Andrea for the intro. I'm going to set a little timer because as someone who does one-on-one talks that go for like 4 hours, I don't want to kill anybody here by listening to me blab on about blockchain nonstop. When I was a kid, like 7, 8 years old, I remember getting in the car with my dad, and I love this format, by the way. This feels like intentionally didn't bring any slides. It's very kind of, gather around, listen to me talk about life 30 years ago. I remember getting in the car with my dad on a Saturday morning and driving into the local donut shop to meet with my grandfather for coffee, because this was his daily ritual, right? And the point of the ritual for me was to get a donut, but for my grandfather and my father, this was information exchange. And so you gathered at whatever version of your watering hole to meet with your trusted colleagues in your locale, and you would talk about the business of the day, and you would update each other on what's happening in life. And growing up in a small town in Illinois, I was subjected to every version of who's growing what in a field, and who's dating whom, and who wrecked some car. All things that 8-year-old me didn't really care about, but to my dad and my grandfather, this was life. This was the substance of everyday living. And the way that they got that information was through interpersonal, trusted relationships. And if you wanted to learn anything back then, you had to kind of figure it out on your own and invest a lot of time and energy, or you could ask someone that had done this before. I recall my dad asking my grandfather how to, work some piece of machinery, or how to build a thing, or how to restore the bed I slept in growing up. My grandfather rescued from some ditch in the country and restored it and painted it, and it creaked nonstop. And then I graduated high school, and my dad, bolted the frame together and it stopped squeaking. So thanks for taking 10 years to do that. But everything was hyper local, and if you wanted to learn, or you wanted to grow, or you wanted access to knowledge, your options were pretty limited. You had to kind of take advantage of whatever resources were immediately available to you in your town or the area that you grew up in. Or for a fair amount of money, you could kind of shortcut that process, and you could go to a school, and you could learn from people who had centralized these knowledge stores and made available to you for a cost access to learning. And then the internet came along and totally changed everything, because what had happened was now information, and by extension knowledge, was suddenly decentralized. And not immediately, but over time, if you wanted to know anything at all, you have this magic tool called Google. You could go to YouTube and learn how to hang drywall. Before, you would have had to have gone to a trade school, or you would have had to have worked in construction for a long time, and you would have learned with hands-on experience how to do this thing. And now you can go and watch any of 1,000 versions of the same how-to video for free on your phone, anywhere that you want in the world, on your schedule, without paying a dime, without having to know anybody. Fundamentally changed everything. And I share that as an analogy to what excites me about blockchain. I don't really care about blockchain, the technology. I care about the philosophy and the paradigm shift that's coming with the idea of decentralization. So I wanted to start with just sort of an analogy to maybe open up the conversation and create some context for the rest of the panelists to sort of, I think, to Andrea's point in the opening, balance the hype with some healthy restraint. The so what of blockchain really isn't about a technology. And by the way, blockchain's not a technology. Blockchain's an idea. The technologies that make up blockchain are things that have been around for a long time. Cryptography, computer science. It's nothing new. It's just a unique way of combining a lot of elements to create this new way of interacting with data. And fundamentally, it brings in portions of economics, game theory, psychology and sociology. How do we manage human behavior? How do we create trust in a digital ecosystem in ways that level the playing field, that don't create disadvantages for certain groups based on locale, geography, political, religious, whatever things that sort of arbitrarily separate us. There are always those that take advantage of that. Blockchain, and by extension Bitcoin, really was created to solve that problem. So the so what of blockchain really generically is, to me, about decentralization and this idea of disintermediation, and that we can conduct business without having to rely or trust or depend on some arbitrary third party. And by the way, this analog world that we're sort of starting to transition away from did a really great job of perfecting centralization. We're at the peak, and it has problems, right? We financial crisis that led to the creation of Bitcoin in the first place. There are countless examples of oppressive governments and regimes worldwide that are sort of taking advantage of the power of their position to hold people back and to enforce their ideology and will upon a people that, quite frankly, don't necessarily have a tool to fight back. And so taking that power and sort of redistributing it in a way that is very difficult, I won't say impossible, but very difficult to game, is tremendously exciting and inspirational. And so I would encourage everyone to kind of focus less on a lot of the hype and Bitcoin's gonna take over finance. I don't know that that's true. I think decentralization is going to completely disrupt how we think about finance today. I think decentralization is going to disrupt the way we think about everything today. But the hype isn't, in the same way that we have a lot of hype around things like AI, right? And AI is not one thing. AI is this combination of technologies, machine learning, computer vision, again, programming, a lot of things put together that sort of create this ability to turn a computer into a much smarter device. But it has to be trained. It has to go through this process to develop it into something that's useful. I think blockchain is going to be very much the same way. Out of the box, blockchain is really not that useful. It doesn't change anything. It requires a lot of thought, a lot of design into how you want a blockchain system to work. How do you want this ecosystem to play out? How do you balance the equities of all the users and stakeholders? And that's hard, and that's going to take a lot of time. So I'd say, lots of people talk about the hype. Let's maybe spend a couple minutes and talk about what blockchain is not, right? It's not a silver bullet. Blockchain is not a cure-all. It doesn't solve every problem just by implementing it, right? And that's an impossible thing to do anyway, because again, it's not an off-the-shelf technology. This isn't like upgrading from fax machines to email. That's a pretty easy thing to do. Implementing blockchain, because it's this paradigm shift, requires first that an organization wrap its head around this idea of decentralization. And given the nature of what we're talking about this morning, right, around governments, governance, government organizations, decentralization really is in some cases, I think, a potential existential crisis to governments and regulatory bodies, because if a digital system can allow its users to, in effect, self-regulate, then why do you need the regulating body? And I say that for really kind of to be thought-provoking. I don't necessarily think that in anytime soon we're going to see dissolving of massive government organizations. But in the long run, I certainly think in a digital ecosystem with a blockchain-powered environment, you certainly don't need as large of a governing apparatus as we currently have. Blockchain's also not simple, and it's the complexity comes both from the fact that the things that make up blockchain as a technology or as a philosophy are highly complex. I'm going to guess that there aren't a lot of cryptographers in the room or experts in cryptography. Guess what? Blockchain is like 90% cryptography, and you know, we could wax poetic here about Merkle trees. I don't think anybody really cares. But that kind of brings me to the next point, is that blockchain, although it's highly complex and it requires a great deal of thought and kind of critical design going into or preceding any implementation of it, which is why I think this is going to be sort of a slow burn in terms of you know, mass adoption and getting to scale with blockchain. The reality is the internet is super complex too. How many of you write code to do something on the internet? Nobody, right? Nobody does that. You don't have to know JavaScript or HTML or have any clue what cascading style sheets are or Rails or Java. You don't have to know any of that stuff. You just point and click, right? There's a user interface. Someone has crossed the gap of human-computer interaction and they figured out how to make it accessible. I think blockchain's got to go through that same process. And in the future, no one's going to care about blockchain. They're going to care about an application. They're going to care that they can do business on the internet in a way that doesn't require them to have an account everywhere. I think an inevitable future state of a blockchain ecosystem is that your account, you are your account, right? You are your identity, and that follows you around. I checked this morning before we came in, just out of curiosity. I have 1,295 unique logins, right? Like I use a password manager because I try to practice good security. I have 1,295 unique passwords and logins. Now some of those are one-offs, things that I've signed up for that I'm never going to use again. But nevertheless, good practice. I try to create a unique password and username for each of those things. That's there's no human being that can remember 1,295 passwords. That's obscene, right? So I think centralizing all that information, right, creates a weakness. If someone were to get a hold of my password manager, I'm hosed. Like they have access to my whole digital domain. But being able to have that identity follow me around and leveraging that to access secure data or to conduct business in a secure way, that's really provocative. That's very useful. So kind of wrapping up my opening thoughts here about blockchain, it's exciting because it represents this idea of decentralization and transparency and security in ways that we've never really had before. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not a silver bullet. It's not something that's going to be easy to implement. But in the grand scheme of things, I don't think anybody's going to care. I think the really smart people, the developers and the designers, the technologists, they're going to figure all that stuff out. It's going to happen. And the inevitable future is it's just the internet. It's just the next phase of how we do business in a digital ecosystem. And from a sort of supply chain or a trade perspective in terms of practical application, I think the benefits are, tremendous transparency and traceability, the ability to know where a thing came from and understand its entire journey, whether that's in the food industry, that's tremendously important. Consumers are more and more interested in the source of their produce and what they consume. If you're Chipotle and you have a supply chain breakdown, it's bad, right? Billions of dollars of lost business. You have irreparable brand damage. How many free burrito coupons did they have to send out to entice people to come back? And I know people that still won't eat at Chipotle because they got sick not once but twice because it happened back to back. Like that's a big problem. There are people that, in certain food cases, there are people that could die. Like the stakes are big. If you're in the aviation industry, knowing the quality of something as small and seemingly innocuous as a screw could be the thing that determines whether your aircraft is airworthy, right? Whether that wing shears off under stress in the air and hundreds of people die. Like the stakes are big. Supply chains are ridiculously complex. They're huge. They span the globe. There's so many moving parts, and each of those parts has this whole wealth of data that surrounds it. And securing that data and enabling that data to be trusted is a really hard problem to solve. And I think, again, generically, blockchain kind of represents this potential to solve really complex problems in very complex spaces that centralized data stores either can't do because they're too inefficient, or they're just too prone to human error or ill intent. So anyway, broadly speaking, I think for the topic of this panel, the value proposition of blockchain is really around this idea of transparency, increasing trust, enabling transactions and data exchange in ways that previously have either been too difficult to do well or at scale, or too cost prohibitive to establish the necessary trust channels in order to fully automate or execute those transactions. So that's all I've got.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next, we'll move to Aaron. I'm just going to note that we'll take questions from the audience after all of the speakers have gone. So, Aaron, please.
Great, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here this morning, and I mean, we didn't plan this, but this is just Jonathan's presentation was kind of a perfect, I think, segue into the remarks that I wanted to give this morning. So, as Andrea already noted, I'm currently on fellowship at Harvard's Belfer Center, where I focus mainly on issues relating to controlling illicit trade and WMD and proliferation-related goods and technology, right? So naturally, blockchain has become an area of interest over the last year or so, but this morning I thought, rather than really talk about specific applications of blockchain to trade controls, I wanted to kind of step back, right, and instead examine what are the kind of key problems, right, and how is blockchain a good solution or not a good solution to those problems, right? Because I think it tends to be all too often, especially from a kind of a wonky policy perspective, that we try to kind of shoehorn solutions without really first trying to understand or identify what some of the broader problems are. All right, so let's kind of start high level, right? So what are these big problems in terms of trade controls? And I could probably sit here and offer a dissertation on this, but I'd rather people not throw things at me. So let me just highlight a few that I think set the kind of stage, the parameters. Right, and so this is again from 50,000 foot. We think about trade controls in terms of efficacy, right? Do they work? How do we know that they're working, right? There are issues in terms of political and economic challenges with respect to implementing trade controls, right? Deciding who gets to control what, why, and for how long. We could talk about legal challenges of international cooperation, issues of jurisdiction. Who has jurisdiction over what parts? There's the issues of national capacity, right? So what happens when states don't necessarily have the resources available to implement international obligations under things like UNSCR Security Council Resolution 1540. Let's see, we could talk about trade controls between, in terms of the relationships between public and private sector, right, and what that looks like. So this list could, I mean, we could literally go on all morning about some of these. But I think that for all intents and purposes, that kind of highlights several unique and overlapping dimensions in their diverse sets of stakeholders. So what I would like to do now is then kind of come down a level and talk about illicit procurement, the illicit trade in dual-use goods and technologies with respect to blockchain. Right, so we know that a state may have any number of reasons, politically or economically, to control certain goods and technologies. But the reality is, when we get down to brass tacks, what we're actually talking about is real people, trading in real parts, real things. Okay, right? These are real transactions. So what do I mean by this idea of illicit procurement, right? So not everyone in the room is probably, a scholar or policymaker in this world. So what I'm really referring to are these networks of middlemen and intermediaries that exploit gaps and loopholes in international financial, supply chain, logistics systems in order to traffic in proliferation or WMD related goods and technologies, right? I'm not necessarily referring to fully assembled components, right, but the constituent parts. To give you an example, right, as Iran built up its enrichment capability, it was in need of several items that it couldn't or didn't want to produce indigenously, things like pressure transducers or vacuum pumps, and it would procure these items on the open market. Okay. Now, what's interesting is these items, they're sensitive. Some of them are export controlled, but they're dual use in nature, right? Meaning they could be used to enrich uranium. They could also be used in mining and oil and mineral mining, right? So how does this work? How do these proliferation networks work? And you might be thinking, well, I'm familiar with the AQCon network, and I think that's a good example. I think that's one that kind of comes to mind, and for good cause. This was pretty significant. The AQCon networks, sold parts to Pakistan, Libya, Iran, Iraq, but it actually turns out that sort of an outlier case. The vast majority of illicit procurement doesn't really look like the AQCon network, right? Now, I have made some sweeping generalizations about AQCon, but I think for the time being, we can leave it there. Now, procurement networks, they vary. They can vary pretty significantly by country, by program. In the case of Iran, for example, they primarily used, I wouldn't say primarily, but tended to rely on Chinese intermediaries to procure items, transship them back to Iran. And they did so because of lax enforcement mechanisms, right? Differences in their legal and kind of political commitments to trade controls. But the sophistication of the enterprise here that we're talking about can vary significantly, right? So things can be, we've seen there are very sophisticated networks that operate across jurisdictions, and then there are some that operate out of their parents' basement, right, with a laptop and an internet connection, right? It really, to be honest, it doesn't take much to become a procurement agent, right? Right. So what are some of the key highlights here? Like, what are the problems when we talk about, illicit procurement, right? It tends to be multi-jurisdictional, right? In fact, several of my colleagues have done some really interesting work on the jurisdictional kind of challenges with regulatory and enforcement capacities across states. Illicit procurement tends to be an above-board activity, right? You're buying and kind of trafficking in parts that that are not routinely sold on the black market, right? This is generally not done in dark alleys around the world, right? You are submitting orders to suppliers, many times fraudulently, but the kind of key takeaway is that you are using legitimate financiers, legitimate shippers, right? And that's a little bit different, right? And you kind of have to keep that in mind. And then I think it's important to note that illicit procurement, many of these networks are quite adaptable, right? Meaning when regulation and enforcement changes, the networks will also change, right? People have described it as whack-a-mole, right? And really, I think from a regulatory or an enforcement perspective, there tends to be this perpetual game of catch-up, right? They're always trying to get in front of illicit procurement. And look, there's probably a lot of things that I'm leaving out, but I think that in the picture you kind of get the scope here in terms of illicit procurement. All right, so given the scope then, right, of these problems, could blockchain be an effective solution, right? So as Jonathan, I think, has already really pointed out, what distributed ledger technologies do really well is solving problems of trust between two or more transacting parties, right? And that's kind of it. You had mentioned a few months ago, we were in San Francisco, and Jonathan actually brought up a really interesting point, right? He said that distributed ledger technology is this it's sort of an antiquated technology, right? And you sort of I think brought up elements of that, right? It's a combination of existing technologies, but it's sort of an antiquated way of thinking about things, in the sense that it's immutable. You can't change it, right? You set the parameters of this system of how you want it to work, and then it kind of goes, right? You can't go back and necessarily amend things. I mean, you kind of can, but generally that's the underlying concept. It's supposed to be immutable, and that works great for things like keeping track of financial transactions, right? That's what you would want to do. But if you think of it in terms of like other aspects of information technology, like Microsoft Word, right? I mean, you don't want an immutable Microsoft Word. You want it to be able to be updated, right? And this is the point that Jonathan brought up in San Francisco. And I think that this is important to kind of keep in mind. And I think that as a quick aside, I think it's also kind of important to note that here today, in some of these discussions that I've been involved in, we are talking about blockchain in terms of regulatory policy, which is somewhat problematic, right? Because the technology itself is meant to disintermediate, actors, right? But we are now thinking about it as a way to, right? Essentially, regulate trade controls or be a part of trade controls, which is an inherently governmental regulatory function, right? Now, how germane that may be, it may not be, right? But perhaps we would just want to keep that in the back of our minds, right? Kind of the underlying concept here, what we're talking about. All right, so let's go back to illicit procurement. When it comes back to illicit procurement, then where are these like key trust problems? So I think that clearly we can point to these issues of end user verification as an issue of trust, right? How do regulatory authorities, how do suppliers know that they are shipping to a legitimate buyer? In a recent case, for example, one that I had followed pretty closely. There was an individual working in a subsidiary of a Massachusetts-based supplier. And this subsidiary was located in China, and this guy was essentially procuring export control pressure transducers and then reshipping them to Iran. And this guy, he was once he got the parts, he was falsifying new end user certificates, and then putting new labels on and sending them. Okay. Now, suppose for a moment, right, that these transactions were on a distributed ledger. Okay. Doesn't really matter. Public, private, blockchain ledger, right? It doesn't really matter. Would this have stopped the transshipment to Iran? No, I don't think it would have, right? I should say, given today's implementations of blockchain, probably not, right? In this particular case, right, this individual was working for the subsidiary of a U.S. supplier. He had access to insider information, right? And for all intents and purposes, everything looked legit, right? So the transaction that would have been recorded in the blockchain was completely legit, or would have been completely legit, up until the point when you received the parts, ripped off the old labels, slapped on new ones, and then shipped them to Iran. Sometimes you did it directly, sometimes you did it through Malaysia, right? Now, I don't want to imply that blockchain or distributed ledger technologies have zero applications in this space, because I think that would be disingenuous. And as Jonathan said, right, we don't access the internet the same way today that we did in 1995, right? So blockchain systems are changing. Distributed technologies are changing on a daily basis. They're becoming more sophisticated. The inclusion of things like sensors that could potentially track actually the movements of goods, right? So you may be able to imagine a system where export-controlled items are tagged in a way that could not be altered, right? And if these parts, were moved from the place that they're supposed to be, then payments would not be remitted to, the seller, right? So there, you can kind of bake in certain types of incentives into a blockchain system. There's also a recent use case that I thought was really interesting of some new high-resolution imaging, right? That you could potentially, today, right? I mean, I'm not speculating way down in the future, but today you could potentially use this high-resolution imaging that's so good it could detect, when a certificate is fraudulent, right? Right, and so I think that, yeah, look, there may be some ways you could incorporate that into blockchain. And then moreover, right, as I think that industry begins to adopt distributed ledger technologies more frequently, it becomes more widely used. I think that the case for exploring these integrations into export control systems becomes stronger and stronger. So I'll kind of end with this, that while I think that the jury is still out on whether or not blockchain is a good continue to happen, that we continue to see industry, right, national authorities, and international organizations involved in these discussions about trade controls and blockchain. So with that, I'll kind of leave it there and look forward to taking any questions. Thanks.
So I'm actually going to take us into some more examples, but still doing it in a very exploratory way. And I think what's already been said so far is that this technology is very much in its infancy, and the potential for it to grow, and certainly, as Jonathan has mentioned, it really is client dependent as well. So each client or each organization will have its own needs, its own users, and network that would have to be put in place. So what does that mean for safeguards, particularly where the idea of the philosophy is a decentralized network, whereas, of course, nuclear nonproliferation issues are very much central within the IAEA, of course. But it's also a network, if we can use that word, of a lot of mistrust, No one trusts each other in nuclear diplomacy, certainly not in geopolitics. So this is why we have, of course, the treaties that we have, the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, but also what are the requirements that states have to make for their international obligations, particularly since they've grown over the last 2 decades. So the IAEA, for example, received annually less than 20,000 incoming reports in 1983. Today, it receives about 1 million. Now, this is nowhere near the scalability issues of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, or even a credit card transactions that Visa would have to do every second. But it does show that the complexity of the safeguards information that is incoming to the agency has grown, certainly more diverse. Within that, there are also some states that are possessors of nuclear weapons. The rest, of course, the majority are not. They all have different obligations under those. They have different obligations whether you have a small quantities protocol, an additional protocol to your comprehensive safeguards agreement. So there's a variety of different obligations that come in that the agency needs to be able to parse out and, of course, verify. So the project that I've been working on is with, in partnership with the Stanley Foundation, looking at blockchain and nuclear safeguards. And one of the things I should really point out is generally, I do not use the word blockchain. It is DLT, distributed ledger technology, because there's so much conflation amongst the hype that blockchain is Bitcoin or vice versa. And so blockchain, while yes, that is the underpinning under Bitcoin, in and of itself, it's also being used for a variety of different ways, and the technology is growing and differentiating. So I came across something that the European Central Bank had mentioned, 10 different DLT systems in 2016. I don't even know what we're at today. Thousands, right. So the potential for how to reconcile a database and the transactions that go through, of course, are probably infinite as the technology grows. So if we look at the IAEA, all declarations, all safeguards information is in a database. So for me, it's the database part. If it's already a digital database now, it used to be paper. Most of the national authorities also had paper databases. A lot of facilities are still on paper ledgers. It's a very conservative field, the nuclear field for one. Even though, and the word disruption is not one that we like in the nuclear field, despite the fact that nuclear technology is disruptive in and of itself as well. So trying to marry these, particularly the narratives, but the I would say even the stereotypes or the misconceptions related to these different words also have limitations within the nuclear field of itself, and particularly trying to explain how DLT could work in this system. So the partnership with the Stanley Foundation has led to 3 salons. One of them is including the San Francisco meeting that we're talking about here on the panel. And it's basically led to the point where we are looking at the potential for proof of concept. And so I'm going to talk about the 3 levels. At the IAEA level, one of the biggest challenges is transit matching. So there, when nuclear material is moved from one, what we call material balance area, to another, domestically or internationally, that information is provided to the IAEA. It takes that information and transit matches it. On the domestic side, about 95% of those matches, and they're machine matched, are done. Only 25% of foreign matches are able to be machine matched. The rest has to be done manually by hand. Now, to me, whether or not DLT even applies, obviously the system that is there is not working. And if there's a technology that can certainly reduce that manual hand work, then of course that in of itself should be something that the agency should look at. The agency is also what we have information-driven safeguards. So it's not just the declarations that come in from other states, but it's also commercial satellite imagery, open source information, trade commodity stats, environmental sampling, cameras, surveillance cameras, remote censoring. So all this information is coming in, and for me, DLT is an added layer, or at least a system that can be provided if we do a proof of concept that could demonstrate, or maybe not, that it can take all this information and put it in a way that the data analytics provides trends for the agency, and also particularly since the agency is moving towards integrated safeguards, where it looks at a state as a whole, not just at facilities or specific facilities. So I think for me, the philosophy is that you have 1,200 and some odd passwords. If you think about all the different streams of information that are coming in, we are working towards a system maybe not just decentralization, but a way to consolidate that information that's coming in for us to be able then to parse it back out. The surveillance cameras, just on that, and this comes to the Internet of Things as well. So as technology is moving, of course, the potential for this for safeguards verification in sensors, what that means in cameras, for example. But one of the biggest limitations to any new technology, let alone a DLT, is the state's policies and legislation when it comes to technology and transmission of sensitive information. So a camera, for example, many states will not allow sensitive information to be pinged across borders. But the IAEA requires knowledge about a camera's state of health. Does it work? Is it turned on? Are the batteries working? Are the pixels, is everything working as it should? That information the IAEA needs, and if it can get that remotely, it certainly reduces the amount of energy and time and resources to go and actually go to a facility and double check that camera. So DLT might provide a way to black box part of that sensitive information, keep that in country while pinging the state of health information to the IAEA. So that's one area. Also with the Internet of Things, with sensors, that generates far more amounts of information that can actually overwhelm current databases. So this is where I also see the potential for DLT to be able to take that information and reconcile it certainly a lot quicker than the current database could. At the national level, and just at the IAEA level, of course, one of the other issues is that because states have their policies and legislations that will limit them when it comes to emerging technology, we have a legacy of practice in the IAEA, where some states still prefer to provide a hand-delivered copy of their declarations to the IAEA. Some use CDs, and some use USB ports. More and more, there are states using what is the safeguards portal at the IAEA, and so there are states, of course, using that. And just 5 years ago, and a developed country finally stopped sending floppy disks. So the legacy of practice is one, and again, we add in this environment of mistrust where the issue, of course, is not just the transmission, digital transmission of declarations, but it's that underlying mistrust that I need to be able to make sure that the declaration I'm sending is not corrupted. And that another state that would, or illicit actor or ill-intentioned actor who would like to mess with my declarations is not able to do so. So whether or not member states can accept a new technology is going to be part of the challenge, of course. But it's still unidirectional. Anything that comes from a state still, of course, goes to the IAEA. If there is a distributed ledger system in place, that does not mean that other states can look at what others are doing. It's very much a one-way transaction, and then that immutable history or that traceable history is there. So even if there is a correction, and this happens a lot, of the 1 million transactions a year that the agency receives, about 130,000 are corrections. So this requires a lot of work and back and forth. And a state can happen where it says, oops, sorry, we kind of messed up a little bit 5 years ago in our declaration, we're making the change. So even though you can't go back and make a change, you can show that correction later, and then you've got the whole history and the record of that transaction all laid out for the regulator and for the IAEA to see. At the national level, another thing that happens, so you can imagine how this would work for a state system of accounting control, where an operator provides that information to the regulator, and then of course they can combine all that information from all their operators and to know where all their nuclear material is and technology in a country that's under safeguards. Or if there's even specific domestic safeguards that are not specific to international safeguards. And one of the things on the trade side is that we have bilateral trade and nuclear cooperation agreements, NCAs. Here they're known as 123 agreements. And with those, states attach on flags or additional obligations to their nuclear material and technology as it moves globally through the nuclear fuel cycle. So this comes back to the tracing of your widgets and bolts, but also uranium and vacuum pumps and all these other things that can go through, whether that be something on a nuclear suppliers group list or whether that be a safeguarded technology and material. There I could see the potential, because there are these additional obligations that the IAEA is not concerned about. These go beyond IAEA to provide additional assurances to states. that here you have what we call swaps. States will book transfers, they'll put swaps in to replace, on paper at least, one pile of nuclear material to another one, because physically that transfer, well, one would be expensive, of course, and there are approvals to be able to put that in place. So there I could see that would be a way to create higher efficiencies, certainly within two states that have a cooperation agreement, but also potentially in the future with the agency where they could plug in the IAEA on that specific transfer, thereby increasing the efficiency of transit matching. So I think the potential as an emerging technology, particularly as emerging technologies are not just in terms of the information management side, but certainly also on the surveillance side, this can have implications for bilateral trade there as well. And lastly, let's look at a facility. So talking about emerging technology, but also emerging facilities. The next new emerging facility is a deep geological repository. So it's an entirely new facility to the nuclear fuel cycle. It's built hundreds of feet, kilometers down in the ground. And Finland, for example, right now is the first country in the world to actually start construction. And these are very much regarded as the solution to permanent disposal, keeping it away from people and environment. And so as a new facility, of course, they're looking at new technology, 3D scanning, what type of geological excavation technologies, and those have advanced quite exponentially over the past 50 years. And then we're looking at information management, the huge long times, or the life cycle of a DGR is anywhere from 150 years just to construct it, which means it's constantly under construction. Materials are coming and going. Safeguards information will have to be updated on a continual basis, as well as safety, physical security, environmental aspects. And then all that information, a lot of that information can be used for each. So a lot of the safety information can be used for safeguards as well. So how can you take that and plug it into the different regulators, and then look at long-term information management where each of the stakeholders are going to have major concerns about the integrity of the data and the transactions that are being done. So this is where I see as a new facility that's coming up, it has the potential to take into account all types in the design phase, so safeguards, safety, and your security, as well as emerging technologies, whether it be 3D scanning, artificial intelligence, and then certainly distributed ledger technology. So I'll end on that.
Great. Thanks to all of you. I think that it was a perfect complement of perspectives and of scope. And with that, I would like to open the floor to questions. Perhaps I'll start out though. First, Jonathan, I was wondering about the cost of implementing distributed ledger technology in different areas. Could you talk a little bit about that and whether it's really worth it to apply it to different kinds of transactions?
Yeah.
And actually, Cindy, a couple of questions for you. First, how is it possible to increase member state acceptability and trust in this kind of system? And second, I'm fascinated by the potential application of this to civil nuclear cooperation agreements, as well as the building of the geological underground repositories. Are there actually examples that you have of countries that have begun to consider this when they're crafting their cooperation agreements? And is there any, have you conducted interviews or heard any feedback from regulators, for example, in Finland, that might be considering the application of this to the construction of the repository?
Jonathan, you want to?
Sure. So unsurprisingly, as a consultant, I get the cost question all the time. So it costs a lot. No, I'm kidding. For $1 billion, I can solve. No. The cost question, I think, having had this discussion with lots of stakeholders numerous times, I think in the micro, it feels like it costs a lot because this is a new technology, and like I talked about, It's not a simple plug and play kind of application. You're fundamentally going to change the way you do business. I think, and maybe this ties into Cindy's answer, but I think in the macro, what you're really doing is you're reducing costs, because blockchain doesn't work well by itself or in a single use environment. Meaning, if one organization implements a blockchain, you could do that. But the real value of blockchain is when your user base is massive, right? Or at least scaled geographically. The excitement around Bitcoin, this is something I talk about whenever I do sort of blockchain intros. No one in the US really cares about Bitcoin. We don't, because it doesn't solve a problem for us. If I want to send Aaron a bunch of money, I can do that. I can do it on my phone right here, right now, and he would really like that.
Let's do it. Let's
And
do it.
I have many different mechanisms by which I can do that. PayPal, Venmo, my bank, his bank, Apple Pay. I got no shortage of ways in which I can transfer that asset. Now go to Venezuela and try to do that. Good luck, right? So, the cost of solving the problem of trusted finance in a place like Venezuela is astronomically high. And if they were going to solve that problem for themselves, that would be one thing. And in the micro, that would feel super expensive. But on a global scale, when you kind of are distributing the costs around, what you're really doing is cost sharing. And actually, you're minimizing the cost of operating a larger global system. So I think in the context of kind of, since this is a use case where we're literally talking about member states, this is a global, system already. And at Deloitte, one of the things that the criteria we use to assess whether or not blockchain is a good solution for anybody that comes and talks to us is checking the box that is this actually a distributed problem? Are you solving this for yourself? If yes, maybe a database is the right approach. It's a perfected technology. There's 100 different flavors of databases. You can kind of pick and choose the one that most succinctly solves your problem and fits your organization's needs. If this is a problem that has a lot of different users across a lot of different channels, and you're balancing the complexity of doing business with a lot of different equities and stakeholders, okay, now we're in the realm of DLT that might make sense to pursue a solution. So in the micro, I think it feels expensive, but zoom out in the macro, I think what you're really doing is reducing the costs of duplication, where you're creating trust in 100 different places. Now you can create it once, and that's a massive reduction of cost and resource requirements.
Member state acceptability. So as I mentioned, there are going to be a lot of legislation and policies in place on information transmission and management across states and across member states of the IAEA. Within that, there are also going to be differences of opinion on how to make something more efficient, where are the costs in the agency, and of course you have to keep in mind that the IAEA has had a zero growth budget for about 3 decades now. So it's even the upgrade that they've had now for their information management system, about 41 million euros, had to be donated. It's a voluntary, contribution. So this, of course, will challenge any international organization. And for international organizations, let alone national organizations, it can take anywhere from 7 to 10 to 15 years for them to adopt technology. And of course, by that time, it's almost obsolete, or certainly far more developed than was already put in place. So one of the things that I hear a lot, of course, is you have to do the proof of concept. You have to be able to demonstrate, and that's where the operator becomes involved. So if we can get an industry partner to come up and show, or at least, and if it says no, then it's a no, at least on that specific aspect that we're looking at. That will make huge strides in education, awareness raising, and about the potential. Because right now, again, it is conflated a lot with Bitcoin, and why would we need a cryptocurrency in nuclear field? This is actually the weird part that I'll get, and trying to explain that. So that's the one part. On the Finns, specifically, because they are leading the charge on building this next generation nuclear facility, they are looking at all aspects. And so they are developing a safeguards approach from scratch for this facility with the IAEA, taking that forward. They're also learning about the different constraints. So for example, the surveillance cameras I'd mentioned before will be used not just for safeguards issues, but can also be used for safety, physical security, obviously. And then there will be different regulators involved who could own these different cameras. But the challenge, of course, is that the IAEA requires it to own those cameras. It owns the information that comes out of there. So does that mean we put 25 cameras up? Well, can you do that? So there's a lot of questions that need to be put in place. But the Finns are the ones that I would say are the most primed. They're in prime position to be able to take a broader look at emerging technologies and what it means for this emerging facility.
Well, we have about half an hour to take questions from the audience, so please introduce yourself before you ask a question.
I'm Catherine Dill from the Center for Nonproliferation Studies. It strikes me that distributed ledger technology, this is for any of you, but Aaron perhaps might have some thoughts on it.
Because he has that
it's the beard,
professorial
obviously.
beard, right? You can sit here and, yeah.
While it could be used for regulators, could see procurement networks themselves using distributed ledger technology as a way to establish trust or to conduct transactions. And just thought if you had, wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
That's an excellent question. In fact, I think that there's been some increased interest, not necessarily in perhaps setting up distributed ledger systems to facilitate like intra-network or interstate transactions between proliferation, but using things like cryptocurrency as a way to evade sanctions, as a way to move money around, in illicit transactions, and we know, right, that North Korea has conducted several hacks on cryptocurrency exchanges. It's unclear kind of what they're doing with a lot of this cryptocurrency, but it's an interesting question nonetheless, right? I mean, these are things of value, and how they use them are clearly of interest to U.S. intelligence enforcement and regulatory agencies. It's possible, right? I think that, I mean, look. There is this well-known process called, of competitive adaptation that occurs in between enforcement and criminal activity, right? In other words, as enforcement capability adapts, so do criminal networks, and vice versa. And it's just this kind of constant loop. And technology is clearly a major component of that. So it's quite possible that as distributed ledger systems become more and more integrated into our economic, political, social life. They will be routinely used the way that we use Google today, right? So yeah, I can potentially imagine a system where criminal networks or narcotics trafficking networks could have a private blockchain system to set up like a trusted ledger system. I mean, it sounds kind of strange right now, but yeah, sure. I mean, we know that this activity actually occurs right now on the dark web, right? So this would be even a natural extension of that. So, great question.
I'd also add, I think there's an element here that sort of the cryptocurrency aspect of blockchain touches on, which is tokenization. And so this idea that you can tokenize really anything, there's again, thousands of attempts right now at figuring out what sticks and what doesn't. But I think from a regulatory standpoint, this idea, I'm really fascinated by the approach of applying digital tokenization to things like regulatory management, inspection management. It brings in an ability or a function to try and incentivize and reward good actors and disincentivize and punish bad actors. Now, of course, that requires everybody to play in the same system. That's a whole, if bad guys can't win in the system, they're not going to play there. Some of that's by design, right? Then you kind of force the bad actors to go somewhere else. In the short term, that'll probably be somewhat disastrous. In the long term, I think we eventually get to a space where there's just no room. We've shown enough light on the ecosystem that there aren't any corners to hide in. It's kind of the goal. And I think tokenization sort of represents that philosophical change to get to that place where that's possible.
So we've talked a lot about blockchain in export controls, but I want to ask you what you'll be looking for in the proof of concept that Customs and Border Control is doing this fall on counterfeits. I mean, that's a lot more mundane and not as high stakes, but that is what they're trying first. So what will you be looking for to see the strengths and weaknesses of this?
Is that a question for me? Yeah, so I don't know. So I think this. Let me back up just a little bit, right? And there was I don't know, a year ago or so when I first kind of started to get involved in this, right? I sort of took the perspective that this could be. I sort of took the perspective from a regulatory agency's perspective, much kind of what you're saying right now. The problem that I'm sort of realizing now, and that I fell into this kind of typical trap, is that you're quick to adopt technical solutions that may not be necessary. And so I mean, I think that if we address this, if we step back and look at it from a policy perspective, right, and look at kind of what the underlying problems are, is this really a blockchain or a distributed ledger issue, right? So in terms of counterfeit, right, now are we talking about counterfeit, I'm just presuming we're talking about counterfeit goods.
Yeah, like handbags.
Handbags, right. Okay, so how does this?
I've got an example.
I mean, so why should they control a blockchain? Why shouldn't this kind of be an organic implementation, as a market process, right? In other words, who is running the blockchain, or who is implementing the blockchain? Right, Customs and Border Patrol. Once that system's in place, right, it's immutable, right? And so as the economy changes, it shifts, right? Perhaps manufacturers want to use different systems. And so I can easily see these things becoming quite antiquated quite quickly. So I don't know. I personally am a little bit skeptical of government-sponsored systems that try to sort of take advantage of market processes.
I would agree. I think it's the wrong, and this is bad for anybody that's in a government agency here. I think government-sponsored systems, it's the wrong. They won't work because it's not taking into account sort of the behavioral economics of why these systems are going to be created in the first place. The market, so handbags, right? If my wife wants a new Louis Vuitton purse, I would really appreciate that however much obscene amounts of money it costs to buy that I'm getting my wife like a real deal Louis Vuitton bag and not some Chinese knockoff. And right now, today, that's almost impossible to do. I don't know where that came from. I don't know where it was manufactured. I don't really have any sense of authority about the source of that material. And I think the promise of blockchain, whether it achieves it or not, is a totally different conversation. But I think the promise of blockchain is sort of, in the financial world, we have this know your customer idea, right? In the blockchain world, we've kind of taken that idea and we call it know your transaction. And so I think if Louis Vuitton can sort of own its supply chain, and it knows for sure what farm the cow came from that leather is made out of, and that data is that the metadata of this handbag is sort of captured in an immutable, unchangeable ledger. And as a consumer, when I purchase a product, I have access to that data and can have some sense of confidence that what I'm purchasing actually is what I'm paying for, that the value is a one-for-one. That becomes tremendously valuable for me. Now, of course, Louis Vuitton then is going to charge more, so that hurts me in my wallet, but I get to know that I'm actually purchasing the thing that I think that I'm purchasing, and I'm not being taken advantage of. Now, of course, that doesn't, blockchain by itself doesn't solve the problem of putting bad data on a blockchain. Then you've just got immutable bad data. So that's why I say blockchain out of the box by itself doesn't solve any real problems. It's a glue that holds a lot of different things together, sensors and inspection data and other ancillary pieces of information that you're trying to collect. It's a great way to store data and preserve it for long periods of time and give traceability and transparency into a thing like a supply chain. But if you don't solve for the good data versus bad data off-chain before you record it, then its value is really, null.
And counterfeiter who incidentally does provide something the customer wants, i.e. a cheaper, somewhat similar looking bag. They don't necessarily charge the same as Louis Vuitton. But at any rate, the Louis Vuitton has their own 32-character ID. The other company does not have that ID, so right away it pops up as the wrong company.
So it's a good point, but why? How does that actually prevent counterfeiting, right? Because if you think of it in terms of an economic, no, I don't think it does. Right? If we think of this in terms of supply and demand, right? There will be demand for illicit goods, right? There's demand for drugs. There's demand for human trafficking. There's demand for all kinds of things, including in counterfeit goods, right? So because a Louis Vuitton knockoff Louis Vuitton handbag is, that it is on the blockchain, doesn't mean that a counterfeit Louis Vuitton bag that's not on a blockchain couldn't be smuggled in and sold in the exact same way, right? It's a simple market of supply and demand. And so I think, and again, these are the same points that Jonathan has been making, is that you really kind of have to think about what is the actual problem you're trying to solve, right? So from Louis Vuitton's perspective, they want to ensure that they have a legitimate supply chain, right? And for people that are buying it in their stores or elsewhere, to be able to verify, hey, this is a legitimate Louis Vuitton. But if you don't care, right? If I don't care, and I know that I can fool my partner that with a knockoff bag, I'll just buy one on the streets of New York.
Danger.
Right?
No.
Right? And
But on this, you've got Everledger, you've got diamonds, right? So on the with the Kimberley process and blood diamonds and Everledger is so, and again, the distributors and suppliers. That doesn't mean that someone who doesn't care can't still get access, but for those who do, the whole supply chain is provided. You can see where that diamond came from. Yeah. So I think that's the aspect.
So. On that, you can acquire that 32 code as many of the producers that produce for Louis Vuitton are also producing the knockoff.
Please make sure you're using microphones
sorry. Yeah. So Rick Hibbett and we've also for Stimson Center, but you can acquire that 32-digit code. I mean, that's the bad data part.
Yeah.
You know, is ensuring that that actually comes from that particular producer or supplier. You know, that would be one of the challenges with that kind of government-run process.
So, real quick comment. I mean, if we just kind of go back and consider this case of the pressure transducers that went from a U.S. supplier to its subsidiary overseas, that transaction is completely legitimate, right? It was then taken and transshipped, and the blockchain would, you know, the Iranians, they don't care. They don't care that it, you know, that latter part of the transaction was not recorded on the blockchain. Doesn't matter to them.
I think at the end of the day, just to kind of close out this thought, what we're struggling with is that we're still sort of 1 foot in the analog world, 1 foot in the digital world. In a completely digital environment where all data is secured and is traceable and you know, powered by things like blockchain and all this other stuff, those problems, you know, again, theoretically, because we're not there yet, don't exist. So long as there are gaps in these solutions, there are people who can exploit them. And there's a market, kind of to Aaron's point, there's a market for people who want knockoff bags because they can't afford the real deal. They want to look cool and carry, you know, the bling bling and all that stuff, but you know, they can't put down $1,000 for a super expensive bag, so they'll pay $100 for something that's a knockoff. That market doesn't go away just because we implement new technologies that solve for the counterfeiting problem that takes care of Louis Vuitton, because Louis Vuitton doesn't want people walking around with a $100 version of their bag. It dilutes their brand.
Right.
So that being said, I'm sure they don't mind people who design bags based off of Louis Vuitton bags and have a look and feel similar, but they just don't want them to infringe upon their copyright and their trademark. So,
or make their way into their supply chain.
Exactly. Yeah.
They can't detect, right?
So I think while we're going through this process, it's going to continue to suck for another 20 years or so, right? Period.
Question over there, and then.
Hi, thank you so much for a fascinating conversation. My name is Lovely Umayam. I'm also part of the Stimson team here, and I apologize because I do want to reopen this conversation because I have a two-finger to Rick's two-finger. So if I get this correctly, I just want to be able to sum up what I'm hearing here, that maybe it makes more sense to look at DLT from the lens of supply chain efficiency and supply chain awareness, and that, you know, once you pitch it that way, the positive externalities may be, and correct me if I'm wrong, security. Because now if you're able to allocate resources to detecting insider threats, right? So as opposed to trying to look at DLT as a possible solution to illicit procurement directly or head on, it doesn't quite work. But rather, if you just reframe it a little bit and look at it from like the trust issue or efficiency issue, there might be trickle-down effects that would inevitably help improve security. Is that?
Yeah, 100%. I think that, right, instead of, let's say, regulator or enforcement agencies attempting to implement their own blockchain system to solve these problems, instead, perhaps promote best practices around the use of these tools, right, and explore how, you know, they can be further integrated into supply chains of security concern, right. It kind of gets to the same thing and solves this kind of problem that we've just been discussing here, right? So.
And because this will suck for 20 more years, I'm just curious whether it's okay to be laggards in this, you know.
Sure.
Is it?
And I would say,
Really good question.
just kind of quickly, because I know we want to get to the other question, but we're thinking about decentralization from a very central bias. So government wanting to create its own blockchains is a central way of thinking about this solution. That's the wrong way to think about that technology. It's not a wrong way for a government agency to behave, because government is a central function. Like, that's why it exists, to centralize, you know, power and governance and all that stuff. So the challenge is, and I think a part of the reason it's going to suck for 20 years is because we have to fundamentally change the way we think about solutions. And it's not the government blockchain or this company's blockchain, it's the blockchain. It's the internet.
The idea,
and so you need government needs to be a node. They need to be a participant in this blockchain, and they need to have a role to play. And maybe that role has something to do with consensus, the way that the group, the distributed users decide on what truth is. All of that's got to be worked out, but we have to start with changing the way we think about how we approach this technology, because it's fundamentally different from anything we've ever done.
All right, I'll take Cindy's question, and then I think we have time for just one or two others. So, and then maybe we'll take those all at the same time and let you answer them all at the same time, one by one. So,
All right, excuse me, so this is a couple of areas in which Cindy's use in the nuclear realm of blockchain might apply, and I can't quite figure out if it would. But we have 32 tons of plutonium that is to be disposed of in WIP. There are many parties that are interested in this, not just the government getting it right. The Russians probably would like to know that it's being done properly, but also the public at large and the international arms control community wants to know that this is going where it's supposed to be going. I don't know if blockchain would help, but it may be a tool that allows access to the movement of goods, let's say post hoc, once it's in WIP, where it came from, and all the rest. So that might be one thing to think about. The other area are radioactive sources. I mean, these go, they leave the manufacturer. Many will go into various instruments. The instruments then go into, be purchased by various users. The users then move them around for various purposes. And somehow having a better way to track where they are at any particular, maybe not any moment, but who's responsible for them at any particular moment might also be a useful thing to know. And maybe the blockchain, the distributed ledger approach would have some application.
if you could keep your questions really brief, then we'll have time to so, we only have about 10 minutes left. So, back there, please.
Deborah?
Deborah Decker, also with the Stimson Center. So I'm really intrigued with the idea of blockchain being married with other technologies for sensors and tracking, global positioning systems. And to Sandy's point about, looking where things go, if you want to talk about that a little bit more. The other thing I was thinking was in Korea, we had cabling systems that were fake cables, and this gets to, in the nuclear field, they're really interested in counterfeit, suspicious items and doing that kind of tracking. If you could have had a smart contract there whereby before you could even release the items, you would have an ASME or something certify as part of it, I could see that solution. That being said, Ethereum, they had to backtrack because of, and do a new branch off of that. So it's a three, because it wasn't immutable and it was a mistake in coding. So three parts, sorry. One is smart contracts. The other thing, how immutable is immutable. And the first part that I was talking about was matching technologies.
I have two questions, but I only ask one. And this, Jonathan Milton Honig, International Center for Terrorism Studies. Jonathan warned against asking a question like this, but still I'll ask it. Lurking in the background is the problem in maybe 10 years of encryption just falling apart, the current encryption techniques used with the public and private keys because of the advent of quantum computing. So this is like global warming. You don't pay any attention to it, but you have to pay attention to it, and something should be constantly on your mind. I'll ask the second question. The other day I looked at the IBM pushing a book, Blockchain for Dummies. And I always thought the blockchain was transparent, open to everybody, part of the group of people having the blockchain. And there it says, look, company, we can block off certain people in the company, so only people in the higher categories get the information. And this really confuses me. Could you explain that?
All right, I think that's all the questions that we
Yeah.
have time for, and you can find the speakers others afterwards. If you want to just take all the questions one by one. And
I'll take the private versus public to start off with, because I think
Okay.
safeguards is a perfect example there. So in the conversation, you're going to come across blockchain purists, fundamentalists, where if it's not entirely open, it's just against the philosophy. But of course, you can imagine systems where there would be private or permissioned blockchains or DLT systems. So for example, you're buying my house. And you and I want to see that information. We might want to plug in the bank, but we don't need everybody to see that information between you and I on the chain, for example. Same thing within safeguards. There's a very strict confidentiality requirement by the IAEA to not share information that comes from one state party with others, unless it's in the safeguards implementation report. So that would have to be maintained, and that's where the permission part would be coming in. Same thing with nuclear cooperation agreements. I might have 23 nuclear cooperation agreements out there with 23 different states, but not all of them need to see what the other transfers are. But I need to see what all the transfers are, and then the ones between each other. So private versus permissioned, or open versus closed DLT systems.
Yeah, there's many different flavors. Again, blockchain's not a specific thing, it's an idea. And so this is why the design stage is so important. You have to really, and Aaron and I have kind of been beaten up on this over the course of this morning, you really got to spend some time thinking about how you want this system to work. And to the point about Ethereum kind of, taking a step back and reforking, that's exactly why. Like, blockchain systems are the immutability of blockchain, which, by the way, is a feature you can have or not have. You don't necessarily, not every blockchain is by design 100% immutable. Bitcoin is, because that's the way they designed it. Ethereum is, because that's the way they designed it. But you have some flexibility in sort of how you tailor the solution. I would say I always get the quantum computing question, and I love it. I'm a former intelligence analyst. I was an NSA guy for a little while. I will say this: quantum computing is going to be huge, and it's going to change a lot of things. The best summary that I've come away with was from an NSA cryptographer who said, "Yeah, I hear you. Quantum computing and encryption and all that stuff. Here's the problem: quantum computing absolutely makes problem solving exponentially faster, but what we're not getting is the scale. And so in a quantum computer, you can solve a mathematical problem 1,000 times faster. But there's two issues. One is it still takes, like, if you work the math, a traditional, the most advanced computer we have today takes like 1 million years to crack the best encryption algorithms that we have. With a quantum computer, it takes 100 years. So the difference is, 1 million years to 100 years. It's not going to solve that problem like overnight, right? Like, all encryption isn't going to go away. Furthermore, the second piece of that is that the people who are, quantum computing is really expensive. So the people who are doing it are governments, massive corporations. Those people are highly incentivized to use that same technology to come up with entirely new security algorithms. So while quantum computing will probably most likely crack things like SHA-256 and AES and all these other, the whole SHA-2 family of encryption algorithms, there's going to be this whole new quantum family of encryption algorithms that are uncrackable by traditional quantum computers at the time. And someone's going to have to come up with quantum computer 2.0, right, to crack quantum computer 1.0. So it's a problem that's sort of never catches up with us. And then lastly, to kind of tie together the three elements here, I'm glad you brought up smart contracts. I purposefully stayed away from that because that starts to get a little bit more advanced. To simplify smart contracts for the purpose of our discussion here, it's just automation, right? It's what we consider now bots, but it's code transacting with other code on a blockchain, computer to computer business, okay? So the way in which I think, the value proposition for things like blockchain and the associated technologies, because again, blockchain by itself, not super useful, But when you start to tie together a lot of different solutions, Internet of Things is kind of a prime example. Take sensors and the data that sensors record, or in the case that Cindy shared, where you don't necessarily want the raw data of the camera feed, but you want the health of the camera. Is it functioning? Is it within its operating parameters? Has it been turned off? Has anybody tampered with it, right? Health and status. That's stuff that we want to record, and we absolutely want that recording to be immutable. We want to know over the life of this sensor what happened to it. If at any point in time it was outside of its acceptable operating parameters, if you're again, I use the food industry because it's something that we all have experience with, but if you know, I don't know why I keep picking on Chipotle. It's actually really good food, but if your transport of produce is in a refrigerated truck, and you want to know that that refrigerated truck remained in a temperature zone that's safe, that sensor, that temperature sensor inside that truck is going to record that data forever. And we would ideally put that data into a blockchain system so that we can go and verify or have auditability of that sensor data at any point in its history, and know before I accept, if I'm the local Chipotle and I'm about to accept this truck full of produce, I want to know that the produce has not left its safe zone for the duration of its transport. And I think that's kind of an example of the value of blockchain. It doesn't necessarily solve problems in new ways, but it gives us solutions to existing problems that current technology just doesn't handle as well as blockchain could.
Thank you, Jonathan. We're out of time, but Aaron, please, if you have anything.
I'm good, yeah.
Okay. Well, it's wonderful